Caution. The AJ and Quill show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. Hi everyone, welcome to Total Party Quill, your stop for monster tactics in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I'm Professor AJ, your friendly neighborhood tiefling, and with me as always is my fearless companion, Quill the Dragon. Say hi, Quill.
Greetings, puny humans. Prepare to absorb the knowledge Quill will dispense with his mighty jaws. So, what are we covering today?
Question. If a wizard is to a lich what a warrior is to a death knight, then a cleric is to what? Answer, the Mummy Lord. And that's what we're going to be covering in today's video.
But let's not waste any time.
Right, let's see what the Monster Manual has to say about the Mummy Lord. Now, you can find the information for mummies on page 227 of the 5th edition Monster Manual. Now, it says here, the long burial rituals that accompany a mummy's entombment help protect it from rotting. In the embalming process, a newly dead creature's organs are removed and placed in special jars, and then the corpse is treated with oils and preserving herbs to help protect it. And then, typically after, the corpse is then wrapped in linen bandages. Over here it says, an undead mummy is created when the priest of a death god or some other kind of dark deity then ritually imbues the prepared corpse with necromantic magic. A mummy's linen wrappings are then inscribed with necromantic markings before a burial ritual concludes with an invocation to darkness. As the mummy endures in undeath, it animates in response to any conditions specified in that ritual. Most commonly some kind of transgression against the tomb or treasures or the lands of the people, and that will cause that mummy to rise. Now it's important to note here that a mummified creature or a mummified corpse isn't the same thing as a mummy the creature. Now it says here that mummifying a creature and turning them into a regular mummy can be done as a punishment. And if you ever watched the Brandon Fraser mummy movies, that's kind of what happened to Imhotep here. Now, a mummy obeys the conditions and parameters laid down by the ritual that created it, driven only to punish transgressors. Now, when we deal with undead creatures, we say they typically have some kind of compulsion, almost like an addiction.
In this case, a mummy's primary compulsion is to then punish transgressors.
It says here that the overwhelming terror that foreshadows a mummy's attack can leave the intended victim paralyzed with fright. And you can see this later on covered under one of the abilities. Now it says here, under Ending the Mummy's Curse, that rare magic can undo or dispel the ritual that gave rise to the mummy. But it doesn't actually say what magic would do this.
Could they be more vague? We'll cover this in a moment.
Although if you look here, it does say that you can lay a mummy to rest by undoing the transgression that activated it.
It also says here that mummies can speak, though they seldom do. As a result, they can serve as undead repositories.
Like an undead Alexa.
Powerful individuals sometimes intentionally sequester mummies away for the occasional consultation.
Right, but there's an even more powerful version of this called a Mummy Lord, and that's what we're covering.
The ritual that gives rise to a mummy can be increased in potency to create a Mummy Lord.
Right, and in this case, the Mummy Lord, instead of being a mindless undead, kind of like an undead golem, would then keep its memories and its past experiences and its personality.
But not its alignment.
Now, as part of the ritual that gives rise to a Mummy Lord, the creature's heart and its organs and viscera are then removed and placed in special jars called canopic jars.
These jars are usually carved from limestone or made of pottery etched or painted with religious hieroglyphics.
Now, the point is, as long as the shriveled heart remains intact, the Mummy Lord cannot permanently be destroyed.
It'll just keep coming back and back, like a curse.
And that's all really well and good, but what isn't the Monster Manual telling you?
Now that rare magic it talked about that can dispel the ritual that created the mummy.
Yeah, actually it's Raise Dead.
A 5th level spell.
And in 1st and 2nd edition it said that a Raise Dead spell would bring a mummy back to life.
However, it's important to note that the rules for these spells still apply.
Right, like the 10-day time limit, or the fact that the creature still has to have all its organs.
Other spells like Resurrection would have to be used if it was longer than this.
Right, or even True Resurrection or Wish. All these spells would work.
Now, something to note. As a result of the embalming process, mummies don't smell.
Right, the whole point of mummification is so that the corpse doesn't rot.
Due to the herbs and oils they place inside the mummy preparing it, they actually smell a lot like a kitchen cabinet.
And this is one of the few things that player characters could use to identify the fact that there's a mummy nearby, that pleasant kitchen cabinet smell.
Now, technically, all a mummy is a dead body of a human or animal whose soft tissues and organs are prevented from rotting.
Right, and this is usually either done through intentional or accidental exposure to things like chemicals, or cold temperatures, or preserving elements.
But a mummified corpse is not a mummy, the creature in 5th edition.
Right, and if you used a lower level necromantic spell like Animate Dead to raise the corpse of a mummy, it wouldn't make a mummy when it did that, it would just be whatever the spell was creating, like a ghoul or a zombie.
Creating a mummy takes something special.
Now, something else to note is that mummies have been found on every single continent on Earth.
It's not exclusive to one culture, and it does happen naturally.
Now, there are 3 natural settings that would create a mummy. The dry heat and salty sands of a desert, so for your typical Egyptian-style mummy. Or the dry winds of a cold Arctic region, which would create an Arctic mummy. Or there's something else called a bog mummy. In these peat bogs, which are acidic beds of decaying moss, mummies can be created. The skin tends to tan, but the bones lose a whole bunch of calcium and actually become spongy and deformed.
The point is, all these are mummies, even though you wouldn't expect to see one that looked this way in a movie.
Now, one way to mess up your characters is to have one of these other kinds of mummies, like a bog mummy, attack your characters. Since they don't see the typical Egyptian-style wrappings on this creature, they may not identify it as a mummy.
If you use the level 9 version of the Create Undead spell, you can actually create a mummy.
Right, but in the older versions of this, it actually had to be on a mummified corpse to even work.
In a much more modern sense, we use embalming on almost all corpses these days.
Right, and because they're mummified and protected from rotting, mummies can last for centuries, unlike a zombie or a ghoul or a skeleton, which tend to decay and fall apart over time.
And mummies don't need to feed like a vampire or a ghoul.
Now, how do you even make a mummy?
The steps are quite interesting.
Typically, the corpse is washed with some kind of palm wine or alcohol, and then the brains and internal organs are removed. Now, sometimes the heart is removed, sometimes it isn't, but the liver, lungs, stomach, intestines, and hearts are typically put in canopic jars. The jars are usually arranged around the corpse, facing the cardinal directions.
Now it's important to remember, some adventurers think that these jars contain the life force of the mummy, similar to a lich's phylactery. This would be false.
Right, and many adventurers have paid the price for making that specific assumption.
Destroying the jars doesn't do very much for the power of the mummy.
Right, really only destroying the heart does something, but it's not going to remove the mummy's power, it just makes it so that you can kill it.
Anyway, after the organs are placed in jars, the body is cleaned once more with the palm wine.
Then they open the abdominal cavity and they insert bags of incense and spices.
This is why it tends to smell like a kitchen cabinet.
Now, because mummies don't rot and their stomachs are filled with herbs and spices, they smell really nice when encountered. This is usually a telltale sign that a mummy is nearby. You can smell it. Then the prepared body is packed in salt.
400 pounds of salt was typical for a human.
And it was then left in a hot, dry room until the process was completed.
Which usually took about 35 days.
Now, according to ancient methods, the body was then rubbed with frankincense and myrrh. It was then wrapped in strips of linen that were held in place with a liquid resin.
That linen is also typically inscribed with spells to protect the mummy in the afterlife.
Finally, gold caps were placed over the fingertips and the toes prior to the ritual and the spells that will allow the mummy to once live again in undeath as a mummy. Now, there's an important distinction you need to make between a mummy and a mummy lord.
A normal mummy is obviously an undead monster, but it's basically a slave like a golem.
Right, but a mummy lord is its own creature. This is a boss creature. They have their own personalities, their own intelligence, their own insights, and their own desires.
But let's go over their abilities.
Right, stat-wise, a mummy is a CR-15 undead medium-sized creature. It has an AC of 17.
It only has a speed of 20, which isn't really that fast.
It's kind of like the slow, lumbering walk that mummies display in the old movies.
For their stats, they have a very high strength, con, wisdom, and charisma.
Right, but only an average dex.
This means they're brutes, which is the monster version of a tank. But they're not fools. They have a personality, and you can talk to them.
Now, saving throw-wise, mummies have proficiency in Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma. Now that's covering 2 of the big 3 saves that you're going to want to have on a creature.
And since its strength is so high, it doesn't really need to worry about that either.
Right, now this means that dexterity is going to be its weakness. However, it also has another ability. Now if you look right here, the Mummy Lord also has magic resistance. This makes it so that the Mummy Lord has advantage on saving throws against spells and any other magical effect.
So its dexterity save is still pretty impressive when you consider this.
Now, if you look here, you can see that the Mummy Lord has the typical high-level undead damage and condition immunities and resistances. They're basically the same as a regular mummy, but it has the added immunity to physical damage from non-magical weapons.
This means you're going to need magic if you're going to attack a Mummy Lord.
Now, something important to note is that right here, it has a vulnerability to fire. If you're going to attack a mummy, you want to bring fire with you.
It has 60 feet dark vision and a rejuvenation feature. It means if it's destroyed, it gains a new body in 24 hours, so long as its heart is still intact.
Right, and a lot of Mummy Lords are known to store the jar with their heart in faraway or hidden places to prevent exactly this.
Since Mummy Lords are created from high-level priests, it also has spell casting, but we'll go over that more detail in a moment.
Now, we want to go over its actions, and we're going to break actions down into two different columns. Instant actions and concentration actions.
Covering instant actions, there's Harm. This is basically a Mummy Lord's nuclear option. It's only going to be able to cast this spell once, so it's going to choose its target very carefully.
Contagion. This is an awesome spell. Typically for choices of what it's going to use to infect a creature, it'll choose Slimy Doom as its primary option, because this lowers creatures' resistances to its Rotting Fist and Harm spell.
This is great versus the tank. Otherwise, it's going to use the Blinding Sickness option, because blindness affects everybody.
Guardian of Faith. This is the only 4th level spell slot you're going to be able to use in combat.
It does 60 hit points of damage against any creature that would dare to approach the Mummy Lord.
Right, this is an awesome spell to open combat with.
Dispel magic is easy to understand and quite familiar. So is Command, finally Guiding Bolt, and Sacred Flame.
Right, these are ranged, either cantrip or a 1st level spell. The point is, they're not very useful or even that good, so you're really only going to want to use these in the event that you have nothing else to do.
For concentration actions, the Mummy Lord has Insect Plague. This fills a 20-foot radius with biting insects that do 4d10 damage if they fail a Constitution saving throw.
Right, this is really thematic. You can make the insect plague either locusts or gnats or beetles or something to that effect.
The whole person is familiar and uncomplicated, as is Silence.
Right, now let's cover its bonus actions.
Sacred Flame is an amazing spell and a cleric's bread and butter.
And it doesn't cost concentration at all, so always cast this.
A Mummy Lord can also use a bonus action to cast Shield of Faith.
Right, but a Mummy Lord also has a very high AC already. It's probably not going to cast this unless it's really taking a beating.
Mummy Lords also have legendary actions. Once every turn, it can perform one of 3 legendary actions at the end of another creature's turn.
Right, these are awesome for the action economy.
It can attack, but the other options are Blinding Dust, which is an area effect blinding, Blasphemous Word, which is an area effect stun, and Channel Negative Energy, which suppresses healing.
Right, and you can use this towards the end of combat when the player characters want to start healing themselves to prevent that.
That'll get your PCs panicking.
It also has Whirlwind of Sand. This is basically a short-range teleport that it can use at the end of another creature's turn. Great for closing the distances or retreating.
A Mummy Lord also has Lair actions.
Right, since you're very unlikely to encounter a Mummy Lord anywhere besides its lair, you're definitely going to have to deal with these.
If you go over the Lair actions, it gives you the impression that a Mummy Lord isn't just a boss creature, it's a leader of other undead as well.
Right, similar to a general.
You can scale the difficulty of an encounter depending on how many other undead creatures you add.
Now, typically lesser undead creatures like zombies and skeletons are thematically appropriate, but ghouls wouldn't be out of the question, neither would, say, a shadow.
Or a giant skeletal snake or a bone naga would also be fitting.
Now, the way lair actions work is that on initiative count 20, a Mummy Lord can do one of 3 things.
But you can't use the same Lair action twice in a row.
The lair actions are giving advantage to undead within the radius against saving throws for being turned, providing undead creatures with a 120-foot radar for living creatures, or causing anyone casting spells to be racked with pain. and cause necrotic damage per level of the spell that that creature is trying to cast.
With that all covered, let's go over the tactics.
Now, first and foremost, if you look at a Mummy Lord stats, this thing is a brute. It's the monster version of a tank. It's going to get in your players' faces, and it's going to hit them, and it's not going to move around all that much.
On the first round of combat, a Mummy Lord should cast Guardian of Faith with its action and spiritual weapon. Remember, Mummy Lords are vainglorious, and their compulsion is to punish transgressors. A Mummy Lord is unlikely to engage in direct melee with creatures it thinks are beneath it. So if these spells fail to deal with the creatures, only then will it bother getting involved.
Now, since the Mummy Lord is a brute, on the second round of combat, it's going to engage with whichever PC it views as the main aggressor or transgressor.
This is typically going to be the tank.
Now, against this creature, once it closes the distance, a Mummy Lord is going to use its multi-attack. To first use its Dreadful Glare against the PC, and then it's going to use its Rotting Fist attack second.
And with its bonus action, it's then going to use its spiritual weapon against the same creature.
Now, I want you to remember this specific combo, because it's going to be a Mummy Lord's bread and butter.
Now, on the third round of combat, the Mummy Lord has to make a choice.
Right, and this choice depends on two things. The creature that it's attacking, did it flee from the Mummy Lord, or did it stay put?
If the creature it attacked fled due to its dreadful glare, then it turns its attention to the next closest aggressor creature in melee, using its dreadful glare, then its rotting fist, then its spiritual weapon.
Right, that's that combo we told you to remember.
However, if the first PC did not flee, it's going to use Contagion to cast Slimy Doom on that character.
And then it'll use Spiritual Weapon with its bonus action.
Basically, you can rinse and repeat these tactics to the end of the fight.
But since a Mummy Lord is actually pretty intelligent and wise, there are going to be some things that are going to change a Mummy Lord's tactics.
For example, if anyone damages the Mummy Lord's heart or tries to attack it, they instantly earn its wrath.
Right, but that's only if the Mummy Lord kept its heart nearby.
I would say the same for anyone using fire.
Now, if at any point there are 4 enemy creatures within 40 feet of each other, the Mummy Lord is then going to use its action to cast Insect Swarm on those PCs.
If a Mummy Lord is engaged by 2 or more player characters, it casts Hold Person at 4th level on them.
And if any of the player characters are really starting to damage and lean into the Mummy Lord, it's going to cast Contagion with the Blinding Sickness option to blind that character.
If at any point 4 or more spellcasters are within 40 feet of each other, the Mummy Lord will cast Silence on them.
Right, but this is only if it's not already sustaining another concentration spell.
Also, if a PC has cast some kind of continuous spell, or a buff spell like Bless, or some kind of a wall on the battlefield, the Mummy will use Dispel Magic to get rid of the effect.
Now, if a Mummy Lord has minions, and a bunch of them have surrounded one of the player characters, it will use Command on that player character to cause them to flee from melee to trigger a whole bunch of opportunity attacks.
Lastly, if the Mummy Lord has nothing else it can do, and it can't reach any characters in melee combat this turn, it will cast Guiding Bolt or Sacred Flame against its opponents. For its legendary actions, a Mummy Lord will use them in the following ways.
Whenever the Mummy Lord is engaged directly in melee combat, it will use Blinding Dust to swirl up a whole bunch of sand and clouds around itself.
If at least 4 opponents are within 10 feet of the Mummy Lord, it will cast Blasphemous Word to stun them.
Now, if the majority of the party is bloodied,
this means below 50% of their health,
and you're pretty sure that they're going to start healing or they already have started healing themselves, the Mummy Lord is then going to use Channel Negative Energy to prevent that healing.
And really panic your player characters.
And it will use its Whirlwind of Sand teleport option if it needs to flee from combat or if it needs to close to melee range with another opponent.
And if none of the above situations apply, it will just use attack at the end of another PC's turn.
Finally, a Mummy Lord has Lair actions,
which are different from legendary actions.
It can only use its Lair actions on initiative count 20 on any given round, and you can't use the same Lair action twice in a row.
With that in mind, a Mummy Lord is most likely to inflict racking pain on any PC spellcasters during combat.
Right, if they already are casting spells, if they're going to, it's going to use this option every chance it gets. So basically every 2 rounds.
On rounds where it can't use this option, it's just going to use whichever is more applicable in a given situation.
Now, like we said, a mummy lord's compulsion is to punish transgressors. Mummy lords are really vain and they're incredibly sure of themselves. They're old, they're powerful, and they know it. These are awesome boss creatures.
A mummy lord's mentality is that the PCs aren't even capable of hurting it, and it devotes all its energy to shutting down and punishing anyone who is insolent enough to insult or transgress against the mummy lord.
Because of this, mummy lords don't flee from combat. They know they can't die.
Typically, we say that once a creature reaches 1/4 of its total hit points, it suffers a morale failure and flees from combat.
Right, but a mummy lord isn't going to do this because even if you destroy it, it's just going to get a new body in 24 hours. But the caveat here is that if the PCs have managed to locate or destroy the mummy lord's heart, it is then going to flee from combat once it reaches 1/4 of its hit points because it knows it can die now.
Mummy lords are vain, but they're not stupid.
Although, if they're trying to attack its heart and they haven't destroyed it yet, that PC will earn the mummy lord's wrath until the heart is destroyed.
It will focus solely on those creatures attacking its heart until the heart is destroyed.
Right, but again, once the heart's destroyed, and if the mummy lord gets to 1/4 of its hit points, it's going to flee from combat.
Typically by use of the dash action or using its whirlwind of sand legendary action.
And that's it! This is mummy lords in a nutshell. These are amazing boss creatures, and they don't get used nearly enough.
People seem to believe that mummy lords can only be found in Egyptian-style pyramids in-game.
Or you have to be running some kind of desert campaign to be able to encounter a mummy. But mummies can be found in almost any environment, and they're found on every continent on Earth. So whatever your game world is, it's not unlikely that you can find them pretty much anywhere you want.
Mummy lords are interesting, they're intelligent, and they're amazing boss creatures to fight.
And mummy lords need not be the enemies. It says that mummy lords can be repositories for information.
Player characters could easily seek out a mummy lord to learn hidden lore or ancient secrets.
And not all gods of undeath are evil. Kelemvor in the Forgotten Realms isn't a particularly evil undead god, even though he may or may not approve of making a mummy lord.
And if you read The Canopic Beam by Jen Kritchmer in the Candlekeep Mysteries book, she uses a mummy lord at the end.
Right, and that was a mummy lord created from the god Severus. So you're actually pretty free lore-wise how you implement a mummy lord inside your campaign, so have fun with it. Until then, we hope this helps you out, get you started using mummy lords inside your campaign. We love you all, try to love each other. When you go outside, wear a mask, get vaccinated, and... Is it time for school yet?
Bye!
Yeah, yeah, yeah.